Tom Bellamy had been hired to fix the desalination pump, not to drown, and for the first 11 hours of the job, those two facts had stayed comfortably separate. He was a marine engineer, the freelance kind, the kind people called when something on a boat stopped working and the warranty company was being difficult. He worked out of a yard on the south coast, and he had a daughter named Sophie who was 6 and who currently lived with his sister 3 days a week because the work took him where the boats were, and the boats were not always near home. He did not, as a rule, work on super yachts. They came with too many people and too many rules, and an unspoken sense that the man with the tool bag was a slightly distasteful necessity, like plumbing. But the money on the Meridian was 3 times his usual rate, and 3 times his usual rate bought a lot of Sophie's after-school care. So when the agency called, he'd said yes before they finished the sentence. The Meridian was 110 feet of white steel and dark glass anchored off the headland, and it belonged, he'd been told, to a woman named Vanessa Croft. He'd looked her up the night before on his phone, the way you do. Croft Holdings. Shipping, logistics, ports. She'd taken it over 4 years ago when her father died, Edward Croft, a name even Tom half recognized, one of those men who'd built something large and ugly and profitable out of the sea. The photos of Vanessa all showed the same thing. A tall woman in dark clothes with a still face and eyes that had been trained, somewhere, to give nothing away. She gave nothing away in person either. She'd come down to the engine room once, early, stood in the hatchway while Tom had the pump housing open, and asked him 2 questions in a flat voice: how long, and could it be done without putting into harbor, and then left without waiting for the second answer. He'd had the impression of being inspected and filed. The crew were polite and distant. There was a captain named Ross who Tom liked, a weathered man who actually understood the boat, and there was a younger man called Damien who hovered at Vanessa's shoulder and introduced himself as Ms. Croft's operations director, in a way that suggested the title was load-bearing for his self-esteem. Damien watched Tom work the way some men watch other men work, looking for something to correct. The pump was a nightmare, but a solvable one. Salt had got into a place salt shouldn't reach, and somebody before Tom had bodged the repair with the wrong seal, and undoing the bodge took the better part of the day. By late afternoon he had it stripped, cleaned, and half rebuilt, and he'd gone up onto the aft deck for 10 minutes of air, and a cigarette he wasn't supposed to be smoking, because the engine room was no place for it, and the rest of the boat was no place for a man like him to be seen doing it. That was where he found the box. It wasn't hidden exactly. It was wedged behind a deck locker on the swim platform, lashed down under a tarp, in a spot where you'd only see it if you were a man hiding from the crew to smoke and you happened to crouch. It was matte black, about the size of a small briefcase, hard-cased, with a rubberized seal and a single recessed handle. There were no markings on it except a stenciled code on one corner, half-worn letters and numbers, EC followed by a string Tom didn't bother to read, because at that point it was just a box, somebody's expensive waterproof box, none of his concern. What made it his concern was Damien. Because Damien came round the corner of the superstructure at exactly the wrong moment, and saw Tom crouched by the deck locker with his hand resting on the tarp, and the look that went across Damien's face was not the look of a man who'd caught an engineer smoking. It was something faster and worse. For a quarter of a second, Damien looked frightened, and frightened men, Tom would later reflect, are the most dangerous men there are. "What are you doing back here?" Damien's voice came out wrong, too high, then forced down. "Having a smoke I shouldn't be having," Tom said honestly, standing, dropping the cigarette and stepping on it. "Sorry, I'll keep it to the platform." "That's a restricted area." "It's a swim platform." "It's restricted." Damien's eyes went to the tarp and then very deliberately away from it, which told Tom more than anything else could have. "Ms. Croft wants to see you, about the pump, now." Tom went, because you go when the client wants to see you, and because something about Damien's face made him want distance from that platform anyway. He told himself the box was nothing. People kept all kinds of things on boats. He genuinely managed to stop thinking about it for almost an hour. Then the weather turned, the way it does on that coast, fast and mean, and the sea got up, and somewhere in the chop and the failing light and the general chaos of a 110-foot boat starting to roll at anchor, Damien found Tom alone on the side deck and pushed him off. Tom never fully reconstructed it afterward. That was the honest truth, and he hated it, because the not knowing left a hole that fear poured into for months. He remembered Damien's voice, "Bellamy, give me a hand with this line," and he remembered turning, and he remembered the deck wet under his boots and the rail at the small of his back, and then he remembered a shove that was too hard and too low and aimed exactly where a shove would put a man over a rail rather than against it. And then he remembered the water, which was cold in a way that stopped his heart for a full second, and the white hull going past and up, enormous, indifferent, and the engine note of the Meridian not changing at all. Nobody shouted man overboard. That was the thing he came back to. A man went into the sea off a yacht in worsening weather, and the boat did not slow, did not turn, did not light up the water with its searchlight. The boat carried on as though nothing had been lost, because as far as the one man who knew was concerned, nothing valuable had. What Damien did not know, what nobody on the Meridian knew, was that Tom Bellamy had spent 4 summers as a teenager working with the inshore lifeboat crew out of his hometown, and that the single most drilled lesson of that work, drilled until it lived below thought, was do not fight the water. He did not thrash. He did not scream his strength away into the waves. He got onto his back, got his boots off with 2 cold-fingered tugs, found the swell and let it carry him, and he kept the lights of the headland on his left and the dying glow of the west on his face, and he picked, with the strange flat calm that the body sometimes hands you instead of panic, the nearest piece of land that wasn't a cliff. It took him a long time. Long enough that he stopped being able to feel his hands and then his arms. But the tide was, by an accident he would later think of as the closest thing to grace he'd ever experienced, running toward the shingle spit on the eastern arm of the headland rather than out to the open channel. And so a little before full dark, a single father named Tom Bellamy crawled out of the sea onto a beach 2 miles from where he'd gone in, alive, hypothermic, furious, and entirely uncertain who he could tell. Because here was the problem, and he understood it even shivering on the shingle with his teeth going like a machine. He had no proof. A man had pushed him. He knew it the way you know your own name. But Damien would say it was an accident, a slip in heavy weather, that they'd searched and found nothing, that they were devastated. It would be Tom's word, the freelance engineer, the man with the tool bag, the slightly distasteful necessity, against Vanessa Croft's operations director, on Vanessa Croft's boat, with Vanessa Croft's money behind every lawyer in the county. Unless the reason Damien had pushed him was the box, and if it was the box, then the box was the proof, not of the pushing, of whatever the pushing was meant to protect. Tom didn't go to the police that first night. He has been criticized for that gently, by people who weren't shivering on a beach with no shoes wondering if the man who tried to kill them was already inventing the story of their disappearance. He went to his sister's. He let her wrap him in everything in the house and put 4 sugars in his tea and not ask questions until his teeth stopped chattering. And then he told her, and his sister, her name was Claire, and she was the practical one, always had been, listened to all of it, and then said the thing that turned out to matter most. "They think you're dead," Claire said slowly. "Tom, if that man pushed you, then right now tonight he thinks it worked. He thinks you're gone." She set down her own tea. "Which means for a little while you know something he doesn't. You're the only person in the world who knows you're alive. I'm not going back on that boat." "I'm not saying go back on the boat." Claire frowned at the table the way she did when she was thinking 3 moves ahead, a habit she'd had since they were children. "I'm saying whatever's in that box was worth killing you over, to them. And the only person who can connect that box to a man going overboard is you. So before you go to anybody, before you give that up, you want to know what you're holding. Because the second you walk into a police station, you're just a wet engineer with a wild story. But if you know what's in that box. I don't have the box, Claire. It's on the boat. No, Claire said. But the boat has to come in sometime, and boats keep records. And you idiot, you took a photo of half of everything you've ever worked on for the insurance. I've seen your phone. She looked at him. Did you photograph it? Tom's wet, cold, exhausted brain turned over once slowly, and produced the memory of his own hand, on the swim platform, lifting his phone out of pure idle engineer's reflex to snap the stenciled code on the corner of a strange box, because some part of him filed unusual equipment the way other people filed faces. He'd done it without thinking. He'd done it the way he did everything careful and habitual and undervalued. His phone was at the bottom of the channel. But the photo wasn't only on his phone. Because Tom Bellamy, freelance engineer, single father, man who lived 3 days a week without his daughter, and so had set up every scrap of his digital life to back itself up automatically, so he'd never lose a picture of her. Tom Bellamy's phone uploaded its photos to the cloud every time it touched Wi-Fi, and it had touched the Meridian's Wi-Fi at 4 o'clock that afternoon, an hour before Damien pushed him into the sea. The photo of the box was sitting on a server, waiting for him on his sister's laptop, under his own login, while the men who'd killed him slept easy believing every trace was gone. The code stenciled on the corner read EC Meridian 07, and below it smaller, a second line, property of E. Croft, do not offload. E. Croft, Edward Croft, Vanessa's father. The man who'd been dead for 4 years. It took them 9 days to understand what they had, and they only got there because Vanessa Croft turned out to be a different person than Tom had filed her as on the swim platform. He'd gone to the police on the second day, after he'd slept and stopped shaking, and it had gone almost exactly as he'd feared. A tired detective took his statement, wrote down altercation, possible fall, and made the small, careful face of a man calculating how much trouble it would be to accuse a billionaire's operations director of attempted murder on the word of a freelance contractor. But Tom had given them the photo, and the code, and the line about E. Croft, and that the detective could not entirely put down, because the line property of E. Croft, do not offload, did not describe anything a living company should be moving around in secret on a private yacht. It described an instruction from a dead man that someone was disobeying. And that was where Vanessa Croft came in, from an angle nobody expected, least of all Tom. Because Vanessa had not ordered him pushed. She hadn't known. That was the hinge the whole thing turned on, and it took Tom a long while to believe it, sitting across from her in a featureless room her own lawyers had arranged once the police investigation made the boat a place she could no longer simply sail away from. She looked the same, tall, still dark clothes, but up close. In the bad light, Tom could see what the photos hid, which was that the stillness wasn't coldness. It was the stillness of someone holding very tightly to something. She'd inherited her father's company at 34 with no warning and no preparation, because Edward Croft had been the kind of man who never imagined dying, and so never taught his daughter the machine he'd built. She'd spent 4 years running it half-blind, trusting the men her father had trusted, and the chief of those men, the one her father had relied on for the parts of the business he didn't put in writing, had been a director named Marcus Price. Damien worked for Price. Damien had always, in fact, worked for Price, and had only been placed at Vanessa's shoulder so that Price would have eyes and hands close to her at all times. I knew there were things my father did that weren't clean, Vanessa said. Her voice was very level, the way Tom imagined it stayed level in rooms full of men who wanted her to fail. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I'm shocked the man was a criminal. You don't build what he built on the sea without the sea getting into the books somewhere. I knew there were things I wasn't being told. What I didn't know. And here, for the first time, something cracked very slightly in the level voice, was that the things I wasn't being told were still happening. I thought I'd inherited his ghosts. I didn't realize I'd inherited his machine, still running with his old crew at the controls, using me as the face. The box, it turned out, was the last and most dangerous of Edward Croft's ghosts. Tom never saw inside it. The contents were eventually a matter for a court and a sealed evidentiary process, and a set of acronyms Tom didn't follow. But the shape of it, the thing it had cost him 11 hours and a near drowning to brush against, became clear enough. Edward Croft had spent the last years of his life moving things he shouldn't through ports he controlled: money, the kind that needed laundering, and the paper trail that proved who he'd done it for. The box was the trail. Hard records, the physical kind, the kind that can't be deleted with a keystroke, kept by a paranoid old man as insurance against the men he did business with. Do not offload meant exactly what it said. Keep this with me, keep it moving, keep it where no one can grab it and use it against me. When Edward died, Price had inherited the same problem the old man had. The box existed, the box was lethal, and the box could not be safely destroyed because destroying it removed Price's own insurance against the other men in the trail. So Price had done what frightened powerful men do. He'd kept it close, kept it moving on the one vessel he controlled access to, the Meridian, and used Vanessa's name and Vanessa's boat and Vanessa's complete ignorance as the cover. And then, a freelance engineer fixing a desalination pump had crouched behind a deck locker to smoke a cigarette and put his hand on the one object in the world that could end all of them. He panicked, Vanessa said of Damien, and there was no sympathy in it. Only the flat accuracy Tom was coming to understand was how she handled things she couldn't afford to feel yet. He saw you near it, and he panicked, and Price had trained him for years to believe that the company, meaning Price, was worth more than any single person. So he made a decision a frightened man makes. He decided you were cheaper to lose than the box was to risk. She looked at Tom directly. He was wrong about who's cheap to lose. I want you to know that I think he was wrong. It was a strange thing to be told by a billionaire in a featureless room. Tom found he believed her. What Vanessa did next was the thing that turned the whole story from a tragedy that didn't quite happen into something with the shape of justice. She had every reason to make it disappear. That was the part Tom understood only later, talking it through with Claire at the kitchen table over and over until he wore the wonder off it. Vanessa Croft could have buried the whole affair. She had the lawyers, the money, the reputational machine. She could have paid Tom an enormous sum to be quiet, settled the attempted murder question into a confidential non-disclosure, let Price retire to somewhere warm, and protected the company her father built in her own name along with it. That was the easy version. Everyone around her advised the easy version. Even some part of Tom, the tired part, the part with a daughter and a mortgage, would have understood the easy version. She chose the hard one. The company's name is on me now, she told the detective, the same tired one who had become considerably less tired as the case grew teeth. Not my father's, mine, and I am not going to spend the next 30 years being the respectable face Marcus Price stands behind while he does the exact thing that nearly killed a man on my boat. I'd rather lose the company than be that. I'd genuinely rather lose it. A pause. Put that in writing. I'll sign it. Whatever you need from me, you'll get. The box, the records, the access, all of it. I'm done inheriting his ghosts. She handed them everything. The trail in the box reached further than anyone outside it had guessed, and the unwinding of it took 2 years and brought down men in 3 countries, and the company her father had built came out the other side smaller, cleaner, and entirely Vanessa's, in a way it had never been while she only owned it on paper. Price went to prison. Damien, who broke completely under questioning the moment he understood the man he'd killed had walked out of the sea, went to prison too, and spent a great deal of energy trying to claim. He'd only meant to frighten Tom, which fooled no one and helped him not at all. Tom got his life back, which was the part nobody made a film about. He got a settlement, eventually, A real one, fair, not hush money, with Vanessa's instruction that it be generous and her name attached to it openly, so it could never be mistaken for a payoff. He paid off the mortgage and fixed the boiler in his sister's house without being asked, and he bought Sophie the bicycle she'd been on about for a year, and he started keeping his daughter 5 days a week instead of 3, because the money meant he could turn down the jobs that took him too far from home. He didn't work on super yachts anymore. He'd been offered plenty. There is a certain dark glamour, it turns out, to being the engineer who came back from the dead with a billionaire's evidence, and several owners thought it would make an amusing story to have him aboard. He turned them all down. He went back to the small boats and the difficult warranty companies and the ordinary salt-corroded problems of ordinary working vessels, because that was the work he understood, and the work that let him sleep at his sister's table and walk Sophie to school in the morning. Vanessa Croft came to see him once, near the end of it all at the yard. She arrived without Damien's replacement, without a retinue, in an ordinary car, and she stood among the hauled-out hulls in her dark clothes looking faintly out of place and entirely unbothered by it. "You could have kept it quiet," Tom said. He'd wanted to say it to her for a long time. "All of it, you'd have been fine. Probably better than fine." "I know. Why didn't you?" Vanessa looked out at the gray water past the slipway for a while before she answered, and when she did her voice had the level flatness he'd first taken for coldness, and now understood was the sound of a person refusing to lie, even to herself. "My father spent his whole life teaching everyone around him that some people are cheap to lose," she said. "He built a company on it. He built me on it a bit, though I'm still working that part out. And then one of his men did the math exactly the way he taught it and decided you were cheaper than a box." She turned to look at Tom directly. "And you weren't. That's the whole thing in the end. You weren't cheap to lose. Nobody is. I'm not interested in running anything that requires me to forget that." A faint, dry almost smile, the first he'd ever seen on her. "Also, you came back out of the sea holding the one thing that could end them. It seemed like the universe had gone to a lot of trouble to make a point. The least I could do was not waste it." She shook his hand, a real handshake, firm, no performance in it, and got back in her ordinary car and drove away. And Tom Bellamy stood among the hauled-out boats with the smell of salt and diesel and antifoul in the cold air, alive, with his daughter waiting to be collected from school in an hour, and thought that the strangest thing about nearly drowning was how it had finally taught him the exact, unbargainable worth of being someone the sea had decided, that once, to give back. He went and got the bicycle out of the van. He'd promised Sophie he'd teach her that afternoon, and the light was good, and there was, for the first time in a long time, nowhere else he needed to be.